I'll start with the science critic today because he raised an issue of whether science is objective. And since he wasn't the only fellow, there were others that had something to say about that. I thought we'd start with that partly because it'll lead to the issue of, what is location? How do we get from A to B? Okay, how do we get from A to B? Okay, so how did it start? Well, I showed him this. I showed this fellow, or I made a video, and this is what was on the video. This is what he criticized. I showed him this. Very simple thing. And I don't know what it looks like to you. I'll tell you what it looks like to me. It looks like there's a rope tied around a pulley, and it's pulling up a box. And so the question is, how did the box go up? What is the mechanism that brought the box up? You would think this is kindergarten stuff, okay? That the box goes up because someone is pulling, or a machine or whatever, something or someone is pulling on a rope, and the box goes up. I think we all understand it just by looking at this, okay? Here's number 2. Showed him this. And it's Felix, the cat, and he whirls around a horseshoe, throws it into a window, and breaks the glass. Very simple. So if I ask a kindergartner, how did the window break? Okay, I guess he would say what anybody would say. Well, what was the mechanism? The mechanism is that a horseshoe went through the window. Period. I mean, I think it's that simple. And this guy had lots of problem with that. He couldn't tell me why the box went up or why the window broke. So what's wrong? Is there something wrong with his head or something? And let's put him on. Let him speak for himself here. Okay, here he goes. Listen carefully.
You witness a phenomenon, a box being pulled upward by a pulley. Or another, a horseshoe flying through and breaking a window. Question. Do you think you can objectively tell someone what happened? Do you need a PhD to explain these mechanisms?
The reality is that no one can objectively tell you what happened there, especially seeing as they're just cartoons. Saying something like, shapes moved around on a screen, well, that's definitely an interpretation of what happened there. And if you really wanted to, you could talk about how the screen produces light, how that light was calculated by the processor, and all that good stuff.
Is this guy for real? I mean, I couldn't believe it. He looks at something, he doesn't understand why it's doing it or what the mechanism is. He says because they're cartoons. What does being a cartoon have to do with anything? It's like watching a movie. I don't know, even a cartoon, you could see Mickey Mouse, I don't know, and you watch it and someone asks you, so what happened during the movie that you just watched? He says, oh, I have no idea because it was a cartoon. So he cannot tell you what happened. He cannot tell you the mechanism because it's a cartoon. But he wasn't the only one. Here's a couple more people, and this is what they had to say, okay? And again, it shocks me that these people are even into science. I mean, what are these people doing in science? They cannot tell you what a mechanism is or why science is objective, okay? Here's what the first one says. Simulating light with particles equals objective. I said that, okay? Belief is subjective. And the fellow says, but mentally thinking of simulating things is suddenly objective? He just means thoughts that are certain. My God, I don't know what's going on through some of these people's minds, okay? Here's another fellow. He says the following. Says, again, simulating light with particles is objective. Believing that this is the case is subjective. He says, clearly this example is disconnected from the premise Bill just gave. But he doesn't notice it anyway. I have no idea what's going through the minds of these poor people. Here's the same fellow, I think. Science reduced to explanation if the subject understands it, but only fully. Then explanation becomes objective. I have no idea what these people are understanding, what's going through their tiny little minds. Here's another fellow. Okay, he says, objective means making an unbiased, balanced observation. Observation? I thought observation is subjective. But this fellow seems to think that if it's an observation, it's done objectively. Observed by whom? I thought observation means a witness, and witness is always subjective, right? Based on facts. Facts are opinion. What is a fact to you is a lie to your neighbor, which can be verified. Verified by whom? Verified by you or by your neighbor or your enemy who disagrees with you. So we have all these things, but this fellow seems to think that all these have to do with objectivity. Subjective means making assumptions. Making assumptions is subjective? Why? Why would it be subjective? Making interpretations based on personal opinions without any verifiable facts. Verifiable by whom? By the Pope? Who has to verify this for it to be subjective or objective? Objective observations. Objective observation. What can that possibly mean? Observation is always subjective by definition. Or assessments can be used before arriving at any decisions. Decisions? Decisions by whom? Again, one person decides one thing and that doesn't qualify as objective. Sounds like, very subjective. Scientific method is objective approach. Yeah, that's the only one he got right, but not because of any of the things that he said there. Okay, here's still another fellow. He says the following. He says, you seem to forget that your so beloved religion, science, can never, ever explain anything. Can never explain anything. It can describe magnetism or gravity and many other phenomena, but it cannot explain them in all aspects, let alone understand them. My God. And I think he got it from a fellow like this fellow here, who was a professor or is a professor at one of the universities. And that's Donald Simonek. He's an emeritus professor, Pennsylvania University there. And it says science doesn't explain, science describes. So I guess that's what this fellow is referring to, okay? Okay, so why does he think that? Well, because for 400 years, it's been the mathematicians who ran the show, and still is. And so mathematics can only describe, and therefore science has become a synonym of mathemagics, which they call mathematical physics. Has nothing to do with physics, it's just mathemagics. It's the unification of math with physics, which is irrational. You cannot unite math with physics ever. Math can only describe, physics can only explain. Okay, and so this person believes whatever he was told, a little brainwashing, maybe a little hypnotism there at the bottom, that science is about describing because we cannot explain. And a lot of people have these thoughts. And because of that, he reaches, these irrational conclusions. One of them there is, if a wave appears as a particle just because we humans observe it, like, for example, the double slit experiment, that means as humans, us humans have an effect on the experiment or phenomena that we observe. This comes from quantum that says that the observer affects the experiment. And these people just parrot whatever was fed to them, and they don't have any mental capacity to even think whether any of that is rational. They just repeat it and say, well, it was proven by the mathematician. They call him scientists, Says, therefore, we can obviously not be objective because of this, right? And if humans cannot be objective, human science, and that includes the so-called scientific method, cannot be objective. These are people who are told that, a particle can be at two places at once, and if it weren't true, computers wouldn't work, and they just believe it. They swallow this like candies. You can sell them the Empire State Building twice. They're so gullible. They never question anything coming out of so-called science. They think all that is true. They say GPS wouldn't work if relativity were wrong. That's the word they use, wrong. They don't realize it's irrational, let alone wrong. We don't have to worry about wrong because it's irrational. But they don't realize that. They say, look, GPS wouldn't work if relativity theory were wrong. It never occurred to them that what relativity says is that time can be bent. That time, a concept, can be bent, and that warp time is gravity, and so on. Those kinds of statements. And it's like they tell them this, and they accept it. They say, well, it comes from authority, it comes from people at the universities, the scientists. So they have no argument. They don't even raise an argument. They don't even suspect that it could be irrational. So they accept and they just repeat it. They parrot it. Okay, so here's a summary, more or less, of what all these people are saying regarding objectivity, whether science is objective. Why is the mechanism subjective? We have the pulley there, pulling on the box, the rope around the pulley, and we have the horseshoe going through the window, and they cannot tell me what the mechanism is. They say it's subjective, and you say, well, why is it subjective? And they say, one of the first guy, the science critic, he says it's a cartoon. So therefore, that's not science. And so he doesn't know what happened because it's a cartoon. Another fellow says, it's a thought experiment. It's not real. It's not out here. It's just like in your mind, and that's why it's subjective. It's just a simulation. It wasn't observed. You need to observe it. Who? I don't know, but he says you need to observe it. I guess some authority to tell him that he observed it and it's correct and he's got to believe it. I guess that's called objective. It wasn't verified. Again, by whom? Or that it's just an assumption. These are the words they use to say why those mechanisms are not objective. Why science, why physics is not objective. Okay, where did he get all this from? It's got to do with this, with the definitions we have coming out of the dictionaries. They're not clear cut. We don't have good definitions. We have irrational definitions for the word objective and subjective because we have 100 definitions for each one of those words. And people take bits and pieces that they identify with the word objective. And so here you have one definition that says, not influenced by personal feelings. So someone might think that's objective, okay, if it's not influenced by personal feelings. But then it continues, says, interpretations or prejudice based on facts, unbiased, an objective opinion. So, you know, if there's an opinion and someone declares it to be objective, it's an objective opinion, then it's objective. And I say that's you have a contradiction in terms. That's an oxymoron, an objective opinion, because opinion is the opposite of objective and vice versa. They're antonyms. Then you continue, dealing with things external to the mind rather than with thoughts or feelings. So they think that if it's in the mind, it's subjective. And belongs to the object of thought rather than to the thinking subject. Okay? And finally, existing independent of thought or an observer as part of reality. So here you have an objective opinion. Here you have an observer, existing independent of an observer. Okay? Well, this other fellow said that you need to observe it. Here it says the opposite. So it depends on what part of these definitions you identify with objective. And obviously, people grab different words from those definitions, and each one thinks that this is what objective means to me, this is what it means to you, and so on. And subjective is more or less the same thing, but just in the opposite mode, like existing in the mind. There, you see it. So this is the problem. The problem is that we have many criteria for these words, and that's really what people threw at me. They said, look, it's subjective because it came out of the mind, or it's an assumption, things of that nature. That's got nothing at all to do with objective or subjective. Okay, so let's get it right, okay? Here's my definition of objective and subjective, okay? Objective, free of interpretation. What is subjective? Belief, opinion. That's subjective. Okay, we have it very straightforward, very clear cut. No other definition is accepted, okay? So once we've got that, okay, we got it, right? Free of interpretation. Okay, what does that mean? Let's look at a couple of examples again. See if we can get back to square one with this fellow, okay? Here we have the pulley again, okay? Please tell me the mechanism of what's bringing the box up. Hopefully everybody on the planet and everybody in the universe that has 2 cents of mind at least says that the box is being pulled up because it's being pulled by a rope that's run through a pulley. That's the mechanism. It's an objective mechanism. Now, if you didn't understand it for whatever reason, then I cannot imagine, we clarify it so that you do understand it. Nobody is allowed to leave the meeting room, the conference room, until everybody is on the same page, everybody sees eye to eye on what the mechanism is that the presenter presented. Okay, he gave a dissertation on how the box moved up. And he says the box moved up because a rope pulled on the box through a pulley. That's the mechanism. Everybody should understand what he just said. And there you have the picture. There should be no alternative. Okay? Now, you might have a different theory. You might say, well, it was something from the bottom. Maybe there was air that pushed it up. That's a different mechanism. No problem. You can have your own mechanism. That's a different mechanism. It's another objective mechanism that we all understand. Once you explain it or you show us what you're talking about, you say, look, air pushed it up. Great, no problem. But the one that the presenter gave, his dissertation was that someone pulled on the rope and the box went up. That was the mechanism he presented. That's the one we all have to understand. In that sense, the mechanism he presented is objective. No one can have a different interpretation of what he just said. If you have a different interpretation, you might disagree with him, say, look, it was pushed from the bottom. Right, you explain your mechanism. You say it was put from the bottom by air or whatever, wind. That's a separate mechanism. Again, you explain it. You show us the picture. It's also objective. Everybody should leave the conference room by understanding what you proposed. We should all be on the same page. We cannot say, well, I didn't understand that. If you didn't understand it, we'll explain it again until you do. Okay? And if you have a different opinion, we could care less. We're talking about his mechanism. That one is objective. Okay? It's objective because it has nothing to do with the mind or whether it was a cartoon or any of that nonsense that all these people mentioned. It's got to do with the fact that the mechanism the guy proposed, the theorist proposed, we all have to understand what he said. We may disagree with him. Irrelevant. The point is that we all have to understand that mechanism. That's what's called objective. Here we have again a second problem there. How did the window break? Hopefully we all say the same thing. Window broke when a horseshoe went through it. That's the simplest way to put it. Okay? The window broke because a horseshoe went through it. Everybody should say the same thing. Everybody should understand the same thing. That's what the presenter talked about. That's his theory. Okay? So the mechanism is objective. Okay? Did it come out of his mind? Yeah, who cares? It has nothing to do with it. Is it an assumption? Yeah. And again, we don't care about that. The question is the mechanism. Is that objective? Did we all understand the same thing of what he's proposing? Hopefully we all do, unless you are mentally retarded. Then we have a different problem. You got to see a psychologist or psychiatrist, That's different. But we should all understand the mechanism the presenter presented. That's the point, okay? So here we have a mechanism, okay? What are you seeing? What is the theorist proposing? Hopefully we all see the same thing. We see a ball rolling around a depression in a fishnet. That's what's being shown. That's what's in front of us. That's objective. Is it subjective because it's a cartoon? Because it came out of the mind of a theorist? Because it's not out here? Because it's just in the picture? It doesn't matter. The mechanism that he's explaining is objective. That's the point. And here you have Mr. Brian Greene, and he explains that exactly. He says, look, if you want to know how gravity works, why the moon doesn't run out of the solar system, well, there you have the mechanism. The mechanism is objective. He's saying, look, there's a depression in space-time, this fishnet, this canvas, whatever you want to call it, and the moon rolls around that depression because it has no chance of doing otherwise. No problem. You don't have to agree with it. You don't care if it came out of his mind. You don't care if it was Einstein who came out of it and he's just parroting. None of that matters. And the fact that it's a cartoon doesn't matter either. The important thing is, do you understand the theory he is proposing, the mechanism he is proposing? We should all understand the same thing. If someone doesn't, we clarify whatever the fellow doesn't understand until he does understand what Brian Greene is proposing. That's the way it works. That's called objective. Objective means we all interpret exactly the same thing before we leave the conference room. That's what it means. Okay? We all have to understand the same thing from the presenter. It's got nothing to do with whether it came out of his mind, whether it's a cartoon, whether it's in a movie, not out here. None of that has any bearing on the word objective. It's free of interpretation. You are not allowed to interpret something else from what the presenter just finished, giving the crowd. Okay? Everybody's got to understand the same thing. If you don't understand, no problem. We clarify the mechanism so that you do understand. But when everybody leaves, we cannot have you leave the room until you understand it. Once you understand it, you're in with everybody in the universe because everybody should be on the same page. Okay? That's what it is. Okay, here's another trick that Mr. Brian Greene gave. Okay, this is another theory. He says that the moon doesn't leave the Earth because it's tied as if by a rope. Okay, that's what he illustrated. You should all interpret the same thing. That's what he's proposing there in this theory. Okay, there's no warp space here or warp space-time. Right now, everybody should interpret the same thing that Brian is offering. He's saying the moon doesn't leave the Earth because it functions as if it were connected by a rope to the Earth. Okay, so this is a different mechanism that he proposed or speculated upon. It doesn't matter. The point is, when you leave the conference room, you can say, I know what he was talking about. He was saying that the moon is like if it's tied by a rope to the Earth and the Earth swings it around, and that's why the moon doesn't leave the solar system. That's what you should interpret. Doesn't mean you agree with him. Doesn't mean that it came out of his mind, that it's a cartoon. None of that matters. That's not out here. None of that matters. You have to understand the mechanism he's proposing, whether you agree with it or not. Okay? We're just trying to understand what it is that he's proposing. Do we understand that part at least? Okay, so here's a mechanism. Okay, hopefully all of you can figure out what the mechanism is here. Okay, let's look at it. Okay, we have this astronaut, and he's carried to Earth by an angel. Hopefully that's what you see there. I mean, it's a very short video. Hopefully you can figure it out. So what is the theorist proposing? What is his theory? He's saying that gravity, for example, if that's what he's talking about, is mediated by angels. It is angels that carry astronauts to Earth, or maybe the Earth around the sun, or whatever. Okay, that's what you should be interpreting, because that's the only possible interpretation from what the theorist is proposing here. You cannot say, well, what he talked about is that the Earth is that the astronaut is tied to the Earth by a rope. You cannot say that because that's not what you see there. That's not what the theorist proposed. Okay, so this is the issue. That's why mechanisms are objective. You cannot avoid that. Science has to be objective in that sense. You have to understand what the theorist proposed what he was talking about. If you didn't understand it, we clarified some more. Okay, and so here's my theory. Okay, and I'm saying the astronaut falls to Earth, and I show this. And you say, well, what did you mean here, Bill? Did you mean that those are elastic bands and he is being pulled to the Earth because all these rubber bands are somehow pulling on him? And so that's where I have to clarify to you, no, that's not what my theory is about. I'm saying a different theory. I'm saying that as the astronaut falls to Earth, all the ropes that from every single one of the atoms of his body, which is tied to every atom on Earth, is simply fanning out. So it's a different mechanism that I propose. And if you didn't understand it, I clarified to you so that you finally do understand what I'm proposing. I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm not saying that it's subjective because I dreamed of it or because I put it in a cartoon or because it's on the screen instead of out here. None of that has any merit whatsoever. The only issue here is, did you understand the theory? If you didn't understand the theory, I clarify it until you do understand it, and then everybody understands the same thing from the theory. Then it's objective. Okay? If you did not understand it, well, the mechanism is objective, but you have a problem until you do understand it and, are on the same page with everybody else. Okay, so there is no interpretation. Your interpretation is only to understand what the theorist proposed. Hopefully we all understand the same mechanism when a theorist explains his theory. Okay? That's the point of the word objective. Okay, free of interpretation. Okay, so once again, here's the definitions. Objective, free of interpretation. On the other hand, objective means, oh, I believe in your theory, or I don't believe in your theory. Your theory is wrong, or your theory is right, correct, or whatever. That's when we have subjectivity. Not because we have a cartoon or anything related to cartoons, or because it came out of the mind, or because it's an assumption, or because there was no observer present with authority to tell you what to believe. So none of that has any bearing. Free of interpretation. You should look at a mechanism and recognize what the theorist is proposing.